It's loading now.
Yeah,
Alright.
okay. Whatever you want to talk about. Neurosurgical past and present.
Shall I go first?
Anyway,
Well,
can you guys introduce yourselves?
yeah. Yes, I'm Dr. Wallace Nelson. This is...
But when you introduce, you'd say, I'm Wally Nelson, and you'd say, you're Bud White. So
okay.
give a little introduction, then
Sure.
a little introduction, then start off, okay?
So I'm Dr. Wally Nelson, and this is the Satsuma Valley of Olympic Peninsula on March the 8th of 2009.
I'm Dr. Lowell White, and
Can we start again? I can see what we need to. Could you make that same introduction again, Wally, and then introduce your friend,
Oh,
Bud White, a long-term friend that you've invited down,
okay.
so they have an understanding of where
Okay.
we are and what we're doing. And we don't need a date, right?
okay, okay. Start? Yes, I'm Dr. Wallace Nelson. We're in the Satsuma Valley of Olympic Peninsula, and to my left is Dr. Lowell White, is a longtime friend dating back to probably darn near 60 years, a long time. And going back personally to my education, it's interesting in that I had my pre-med and medical school training at the University of Washington, and I had gotten out of the service in World War II, and at that time they had the marvelous Bill of Rights, which meant that if you had served in the armed forces, that you'd get a month and a half of paid education plus, I think it was $102 a month for every month that you served in the service. So I went to pre-med at the university, and then to medical school at the University of Washington. It had just opened up in 46. And the result was that using the GI Bill of Rights, I got through pre-med and medicine, and I didn't pay 1 penny of tuition. And that was fantastic, because you look at the guys coming through now, and they're ending up with having borrowed like $150,000, $200,000 to make it through the medical school's current situation. But that was a great benefit, because I have strong feelings now about education and the high cost of it that has to be addressed, particularly if we have a newer system that's going to require lids on costs in every aspect. It's hard to imagine a young guy coming out with $200,000 in debt and a sharp lid on his income, because it's practically impractical in some ways. But I'm sure they can solve that, but it does require that education for that length of time in some way be subsidized so that people can actually manage it. But the University of Washington at that time, again, was a new school.
You pick up there, but I think you need to be looking at him, because otherwise you're both looking at him. So
Okay.
when he's talking, you look at him and vice versa.
Yeah.
And you kind of interject with and
Yeah.
something, so you're kind of interacting.
Yeah.
But the medical school at that time required that you, when you finished to get your degree, you had to have a paper of research, so that you had to develop some research during your last year or two and make a more or less something that would be suitable for publication, a PhD type scenario. It's not required anymore, but it was at that time. And that's really what got me going in neurosurgery, because my paper that I produced at that time was in that of a particular pathway in the spinal cord and brain, the spinothalamic tract, that could be interrupted surgically with resultant relief of pain at various levels. And that is something that Dr. Arthur Ward, I think, acknowledged as being a worthwhile paper, and it was. so that when later I went back in the service during the Korean War with and commissions with the U.S. Navy and U.S. PHS, and served in the Coast Guard as well as a position on the icebreaker Northwind, which was interesting. But that led to the point where after I finished that tour, I had to make a decision of what I was going to do. And in deciding to be a neurosurgeon, it really comes down to you have to evaluate yourself. I mean, do you have the chops to go in and cut somebody's brain open and all that? And it kind of leaves you, seriously thinking about that, which I did do. I was stationed down at Alameda, and I said, I think I want to give it a try. And so I contacted Dr. Ward, and he was receptive to the idea, but said, of course, I'd have to get my general surgery training beforehand, and this was part and parcel at that time. So I got a residency at Virginia Mason in general surgery, and finished 2 years there, and was then accepted into the neurosurgery program. And I was reading a recent article on from the Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh sends out a nice published pamphlet. It kind of surveys their progress, their to date, and what they're doing, and so forth. And I was looking at the residents that they gave the names of everybody, and it seems to me that the basic course in residency after you get out of medical school was 6 or 7 years, and I thought that's a long time, but then I figured how it was when I went through, and it was the same, 6 years. So that hasn't changed much. But the thing that's just been astounding to me is the change in neurosurgery, and it's there are 10 subspecialties in neurosurgery now, so that somebody that finishes a neurosurgical program really has to think hard about getting into one of the subspecialties and taking a special training in that. And that's going to take a year or two if he wants to do vascular and whatever, skull base. And you're getting kind of old about that time. I think, if you did all that, well, of course, nobody's going to be in the service these days and then going to medical school, but it means that you're probably going to be in your early 30s at the least before you ever finish training. And that's a kind of a long stretch for some young people, but it's doable. And the thing that struck me the most during neurosurgery program was it was enjoyable as far as the whole process. It was hard, but it was enjoyable because there was a lot of camaraderie, feelings between people in the training program and the hospitals and so forth. And it wasn't as though you were treading water waiting to get out in my private practice. It was just a growing experience and basically enjoyable. And the quality of people that the university got into their program really impressed me, particularly in retrospect. And that has to do with what people from the program have done and what the original people that came to the university in neurology and so forth have done. I mean, Dick Schmidt was one of the early neurologists, and he was a great guy. And he went on to become head of a department, then a chancellor of a university. And then the original neurologist became the guru of neurology back at Columbia. Who was that?
Cornell. Yeah.
Cornell.
Fred Plum.
Fred Plum, yeah. And he took one of the residents with him when he went from the University of Washington to Cornell. And that young fellow was a year behind me. He's become the guru of Cornell. So the quality of the people.
That's Jerry Posner.
Yeah, Jerry.
Yeah.
And Jerry now is doing pretty much what Fred Plum did, but I guess Fred, I don't know how old he is, but he's getting into dotage, I think. So but the quality of people was excellent, and how they recruited them, I have no idea, but they certainly did a good job.
Well, I can see from watching this, if after going through the subject a little bit, if we could go back and forth a little bit.
Oh,
Because otherwise we got one person not
Yeah.
saying anything for a long
Yeah.
period of time. So you do it, to cover the same material, we'll go back and forth. a
Yeah.
little bit.
well, I think Bud certainly, you
Well,
have,
if you tap the table also, we pick it up on the
Hmm?
microphone, tapping the table.
oh, so Bud certainly has the greatest picture of the academic life at the university, because he prospered from that, and I think, when I went down private practice, you were certainly in the academic field at the university before you went to Florida, and you had some interesting work, I know, with Bonica and pain management and things like that,
Yeah.
and
Actually, John Bonica was quite an interesting
Yeah.
person to really work with. He was quite an addition. He came from Tacoma,
yeah,
where he, all by himself, had written what still is almost like the Bible in pain. He was an excellent.
he was the masked marvel of wrestling.
Yeah, that's right. He was a wrestler, and he wrestled as a masked marvel in New York.
That's right.
When he was in school. But he was an excellent teacher, and I had enjoyed myself working with him. I had made my decision that I was really more interested in the nervous system and teaching it than actually doing neurosurgery all the time at that point. And was pretty heavily involved in administration at the University of Washington before I left to go down to take the chair at the University of Florida. And of course, it was not a chair of a department. At the University of Florida, neurological surgery was still part of the surgery department. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when neurosurgery was able to split out from the surgery department, the neurology people that were originally in both the Department of Medicine and the Department of and in neurological surgery were able to flourish in a joint type of training program. We had some relationship with psychiatry at that point, but not a great deal. My background was pretty much the same as Wally's in terms of being a corpsman during World War II and becoming very interested in the nervous system. Luckily, had the GI Bill as well, which put me through. And when I look at the medical students today and what it costs for them to go to medical school without any relief, it's just astounding to me. I think the thing that was important, however, in my career was recognizing that this area of neuroscience was going to be a very important part of it, of neurology of the future and psychiatry of the future. And I spent most of my time working in this area. From the initial research that I was involved with John Bonica, we were able to establish the pain clinic down at the University of Washington. This has sort of been a stepchild to the new form of family practice, which is known as sports medicine, because we sort of set the stage for how you could do that kind of clinical work where you worked as a group in patient care, but they still had somebody that they could call their doctor. And there was two of my medical school colleagues that worked in that area. One was Gene Coe, the other was Bill Fisher. They were two general practitioners that made the thing work. And when you look at medicine today and the things that are going on, I marvel at how we're using the technical things that we're doing today and how well patients are taken care of up to a point. I think the dollar has made it very hard to render hospital care and what I used to call, when trying to teach about it, the laying on the hands in medicine. And this was extremely important when the patient was conscious in neurosurgery. Nobody wanted anybody playing around with their brain. So that the neurosurgeon had to really be the friend. Like all doctors should be friends. And I think this was one of the areas in that really is at the foundation of neuroscience, as I see it, in the medical education program in general. This is a little far afield from neurological surgery, but I think that it's important when we look at the training programs that we have today and realize that neurological surgery supported the idea of training programs, but didn't partake in the training programs like neurology and did within internal medicine and this kind of thing. We tended to encourage, as neurosurgeons in the academic program, that your training grants go primarily in the area of neurology and psychiatry rather than surgery. I think this led to a separation of neurology. And one of the things that Arthur Ward did when he was at the University of Washington was to bring all of these people together into one place so that we could handle our clinical problems. We had neurology, neurological surgery on the same floor at the Harborview Hospital. We had psychiatry one floor up. And in those days, we had a judge that could help us out if we had any problems with the psychiatric illnesses. Everything was together, and he brought this together within the training program. I think this is one of the reasons why Arthur Ward was so successful in turning out primarily academic neurosurgeons during the early years in the program, as Dr. Nelson mentioned. I would say that there are a lot of anecdotal things that you could say about the programs in those days. One of the things that I think is different, that we don't have the opportunity as physicians to give patients a chance to heal within the hospital. They have to heal at home. When I think about what I see today of sending a patient that's had a primary back operation home in a day and a half, I just can't believe it, you know. And it's different, totally different than it used to be.
Or same day.
Or the same day. And all of this is related to money. And I hope that really we might get some changes in this if we can organize this healthcare system a little bit differently than we have in the past.
The thing that, of course, impresses me the most is the ease with which information is available. I can remember writing my doctorate thesis that I had to go to the library and look through all the little card indexes from Materia Medica to look up each article and then have it checked out, the book out, and it was just awesome amount of work. I look at my grandchildren now, and they sit down to the computer at a very young age, and you know, they can get anything they want to know just by typing in a few keys here and there. And that, of course, is the way medicine is changing too, and I think to the advantage is that doctors have the ability to search pertinent information that they need in the treatment of an individual patient, and they can do it on their computers and look at stuff that in my day would certainly have taken a great effort to go to the library and look it up and get the book published or get an article to look at. And that's just awesome to me. And it's going to be even more so in the future. This is, quote, the information age, and I certainly believe it. But the ease with which people can get information is just going to become greater and greater, and that's a big plus. I can understand them talking about computerizing doctors' offices and so forth. That's great, but it requires, I think, a generation to accomplish it. I think you have to take the current medical students that have gone through with their computers, and they'll be more at ease with it because I've seen doctors, you know, that locally or otherwise, that you come in and you give them a history of something, and they're just sitting with their computer just plunking it all in, so that at the end of the session, they got everything all printed out, and that's what is going to help a lot because, transferring that information at some subsequent date where it's needed elsewhere would become much easier and make for a lot fewer mistakes and a lot more quick and appropriate action for a medical illness. I'm certainly enthusiastic about the way things are going as far as the information age goes. It's going to make a big difference, but I think it's going to take a generation to really get into it.
You guys, I'm thinking for the website presentation, maybe we should start with the two of you together, in which case we'll re-identify you and your career just in a paragraph, and then Rick, what we can do is we can go down the buttons going back and forth. So I think probably having it together. So maybe what we should do is we'll reintroduce yourselves again, and have you, Wally, introduce yourself and where you are as you did in today's date. Might be interesting. I don't know. Go on, Dave. I don't know. Maybe no. And then what if you could do, Wally? You can just say I was born in Seattle, went to college here, medical school here, residency here, and then after residency I had these. I was in the Navy, I was in and I was in private practice. I retired from private practice in such and such a day. And then we would do, and then you would say, and I've invited my friend Bud White down to the day and be with it. And then you'd introduce yourself. And after you're through introducing yourself, well, you could say the two of us have been asked to make some comments about the history of neurosurgery in the area. Then what we'll do is we'll take that part. It's easier to do it this way and try and edit it together. And then we'll put you, our website, we'll have that as the first button. And then we'll pick another subject and we'll go back and forth between you guys. And you'll be against the books and you'll be against the purple. And I think that will look good. So we'll do the reintroduction here. You introduce your friend, Bud White. And be sure, Bud, to put all of your academic, marks in there so we know you from medical undergraduate to medical school to residency.
Okay.
All the way, just in a bullet form. And then the two of you would agree that you're being interviewed about the history of medicine, about the history of neurosurgery in the Northwest.
So really, you want us to do the bibliography? Well, I've done pretty well on it.
So
I
first,
kind
and I
of.
want to have it all in one spot.
Sure.
I'll
Okay.
tell you, it'll take us 5 minutes to do this, and Rick knows to do this.
Oh yeah.
On the computer will take us an hour.
Sure.
So if you don't mind.
No problem.
And I just, before we get there, if you want to have a date on, have them say a date, I think probably not, dates it. So don't put the date on, but the place and everything else. Okay, well, I'll give them.
Okay. Yes, I'm Dr. Wallace Nelson. I was born during the mid-1920s, and both of my parents were Swedish immigrants. I was raised in the Seattle area. I went to Broadway High School, which no longer exists. And then during World War II, I served in the Army Air Corps and on a B-29. And during my service, I did spend a stretch of 3 months in the hospital. And that was noteworthy because it had nothing to do with my desire to go into medicine. But it was just a kind of a chronicle of what the state of medicine was at that time. And it had to do with what antibiotics were available and so forth. And penicillin, this was in early spring of 44.
Well, I interrupt you. We can come back. What I like to do, people I like them to watch this in over 3-4 minutes, 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes. Get your whole life in 2 minutes.
No problem.
And then you in 2 minutes. Then you introduce Bud. Okay, he does it. And then at the end you say, we're here today to discuss the history of neurosurgery.
Yeah.
Then after that we can go back. But I think we like to capture that also within just a few minutes. They see who all these buttons are.
Yeah. So,
You guys know too much. So.
start over? Okay. Yeah, I'm Dr. Wallace Nelson, and I was born in the middle 1920s. Both of my parents were Swedish immigrants. Grew up in Seattle. During World War II, I served in the Army Air Corps on a B-29. And after the war, I attended the University of Washington on the GI Bill of Rights, and subsequently the medical school that was formed in 1946, and I was in the 3rd class. During the Korean War, I served as a medical officer in the latter part. And then after that, I trained in general surgery at the Mason Clinic, then neurosurgery at the University of Washington, and following that completion of that, practiced neurological surgery in Seattle for approximately 30 years, and then quit doing actual surgery some 26 years ago. The field of neurosurgery, of course, has changed radically, and I experienced that. And currently, I'm retired and living in a very remote area and enjoying it immensely. But
Yeah. Well, I'm Lowell White, and I grew up in the Seattle area as well, in Lake City. I went into the service and was a corpsman, at which time I became extremely interested in the nervous system, and particularly in neurological surgery, which I experienced only a minor amount of it as what they used to call an operating room corpsman. I came back, went through the College of Pharmacy, and got my BS degree in pharmacy, but with a lot of introductory pre-med courses mixed into the curriculum, so that they wanted to be sure that I would never get a license to practice pharmacy when they let me out of the school, and to go to the medical school, which was at the University of Washington. I was in the fourth class, one class behind Wally, and this was a really very excellent experience, good learning experience, a young faculty. Everything about my medical education was just extremely enjoyable. And very challenging all the way through up to the thesis that Wally was talking about. And I did mine on drug addiction, because I was able to get morphine from the College of Pharmacy and get around the Treasury Department, so I was able to study this kind of thing. I went on then to the University of North Carolina, where I did my surgical training, and finishing the surgical training, I came back to the University of Washington in the neurological surgery program. I completed that and was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, and was able to spend a year in the area that I was extremely interested in, developing neuroscience. And I was at the University of Oslo in the anthropology department, where the anatomy department was located, and I had the opportunity of being sort of in the central area of all the neurology and psychiatry people on the university coming into this area. This is the completion of the training. Came back and went on to joined Arthur Ward as a partner in neurological surgery, and Eldon Foltz. Following that, I became Associate Dean for Research and Development at the University of Washington in the medical school. Finishing that, I was recruited because of my activity in neuroscience to the University of Florida, where they wanted to bring neuroscience into the total curriculum of the medical school. They already had neuroscience developed in the basic science department, and they wanted to have clinical neuroscience as well. This really, with the funding that was going on in medical education at the time, did not work, and I was recruited then to help start the last medical school in Mobile, Alabama. And it was there that I retired and came back to my homeland, and I live now in Mukilteo, Washington.
That's good. I think people do not understand who
Yeah.
you are, and we'll start with that, because they won't know you. Good. Any other things?
well, I think just the times, the thing that made quite a difference in the medical school class that I was within, and the same with Bud, was that the veterans from World War II were a large proportion. In my class, it was 80+% were veterans. So that we're a little bit older, kind of anxious to get on with it, and I think we were pretty well motivated. But there were some pretty mature individuals in the class, and I think that made a little bit difference as far as how the class itself functioned and so forth. But it was a different time, and the school, of course, was young, but I think everybody was anxious to make it work right.
Can you guys comment on maybe your biggest emotional highs and lows in practice, your biggest success and your worst failure, something that would grab somebody if you were to talk about it? Do you remember any cases, people, individuals, cases, things like that?
Well, probably the one case that I
Of course,
think,
we have to watch HIPAA, and we have to make sure we don't mention names or.
no. One case I remember the most surgically was a case of a lady, very nice lady, who had a brain tumor. It was a meningioma, which is a benign tumor, but this one was situated in a bad spot. It was wrapped around the optic nerve. It was attached to the sinuses of the medial aspect of the brain, and of course the medial sphenoid wing. And fortunately for me, the tumor itself was of a soft constituency, so that it was possible to strip it off the optic nerve, and it was possible to take it off the medial sphenoid wing and the sinuses, and then to cauterize the area and get it what I thought was a total removal. And I know that that was, golly, almost 30 years ago, and she's still alive. So I think that was my best surgical case that I remember vividly. The downers, one that still bothers me, is a case that was at Children's Orthopedic, and it was a young boy who came in an emergency extremis and had obviously papilledema, much pressure on the brain, and this was before any studies were available, so I put a needle in his ventricle and tapped it, and did an air study and found he had a big brain tumor. And that resulted immediately in doing a shunt procedure to relieve the pressure, ventriculoperitoneal shunt, which worked great, and he did well. But the study did reveal this tumor alongside the brainstem on the right side, and so I operated, and the tumor extended from C2 all the way up through the incisura, which means it was extending into the middle fossa. And every darn cranial nerve itself was incorporated in that. And I was a young boy, so I said to heck with it and go for it. And I did, and I took the tumor out, but in the process sacrificed multiple cranial nerves. And that bothered me a lot. Still does. Sorry about that. But he turned out pretty darn well. He had no paralysis, no nothing. He was mentally alert and so forth, but he had no cranial nerves on the right side. But otherwise he was a pretty normal boy. But the question I have in retrospect, would I have done that today? I don't know. Probably not. I probably wouldn't have sacrificed the cranial nerves. I would have decompressed them, taken the pressure off, and hoped that X-ray would take care of it. I don't know, but he did very well otherwise, and I assume that somebody's done a little bit of plastic surgery to take care of the facial paralysis and the eyelid and so forth. But that was traumatic. It's a major decision to make. You make it on the spot, and you do what you think you're going to have a chance to succeed with, but you leave behind deficits that you would, they're pretty prominent. My only salvation is that he grew up to be a nice young man. He did get radiation afterwards, but I think the last I saw him was many years later, and he was still doing okay. but with his deficits. So that's the one that bothered me the most of my surgical career. So, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, when I stop and think about the things I'm really I'm proud of, one of them has to do with the pain clinic down at the UW, because this area of intractable pain was a rather serious situation. And my interest was in pain and seizures, and I sort of concentrated more in the pain area, and we were able to put the thing together. And through the help of Time Magazine, as I mentioned in discussions with other people, it spread a concept throughout the world.
Yes.
That works, and it has to be multidisciplinary, and of course that's the way things are today. And I'm really rather proud of the thing that John Bonica and I did. It was back in the 60s. The real downer, however, and some of the comments that I've made as a medical educator, is my attempts to get neuroscience as such into the 4-year curriculum of a medical school. And the only place that it's ever been accomplished of the medical schools that are around is down in San Diego, where they put neuroscience into the university before they developed the medical school.
Oh, John Oxney?
And that, of course, is where John Oxney was. And John went from neurosurgery to the dean to being chancellor of the university. And they really, to me, that's the biggest downer in my career. And I think it's coming. The one thing that the computer has brought into neuroscience is our ability to handle large volumes of information and not be overwhelmed.
Right.
As you mentioned, Wally, we used to be able to go to the library and read the articles that were written in the areas that we were interested in once a week, and you could sit there and do that in about an hour,
Yeah.
or at least browse through them. That's all changed, and the computer has allowed us to do things with statistics and the evaluation of patient histories, patient lifestyles, and now with the beginning of our understanding of the human genome and putting that with what we've learned about the immune system, and now we put in the central nervous system, and we've got the 3 databases that are in the human body. And the computer has got the ability to look at all of this in terms of information theory and make strides that I think we're just not going to realize in the future. This is in the area of neuroscience, of which I believe that the first public lecture in neuroscience that was given when neuroscience started in this country was given by Dr. Arthur Ward.
Really?
And as you know, the Dalai Lama gave the public lecture last year. So that tells you a little bit about what neuroscience is all about. And I think when we begin to amalgamate this into medical education, that the doctors of the future are going to be much broader, much better grounded in the humanities, and particularly the appreciation of the differences in human behavior, which certainly strongly influences the way patients recover from disease.
Yeah, the perspective that I have of neurosurgery that Bud and I experienced is that, it started over 50 years ago, and up to the present time, if you kind of extrapolate that backwards, subtract that, you'd get back into the late 1800s or 1900. And what was neurosurgery like then? Well, not much. And it's made such tremendous progress that it really is to the advantage of the patient in that we have 10 subspecialties, I guess, in neurosurgery. But it's just totally foreign to anything that we practice, since there was one practice of neurosurgery, period. You did it all. And that wasn't necessarily the best way, but it's possible now to fractionate neurosurgery into multiple fields and have real hot shots in each one, and the patient can't do anything but be benefited by that. So it's all changing. It's all getting better, and it's just different.
Yes, I think, the thing is getting medicine to come back together again.
Yeah.
So that the poor patient that walks in the door gets a little bit of insight on the doctor, because the doctor's got to be their friend. And I think
Yeah.
this is so important, and I think it's important that we use the techniques that we have today to document for patients what you have to offer and what you can depend on. I think we've slipped a long ways from that, from when you and I were in training, but it's coming back, and I can't predict what the future is going to be, but I think that the ethical approach to the practice of medicine, and neurosurgery in particular, is going to become much stronger.
The practice of medicine per se, living where I do down here, I don't go to a doctor. I go to a nurse practitioner, and the nurse practitioner takes care of my problems quite well. And the only time I ever go up to Seattle to see a specialist, if I have something major that requires surgery or something like that. All this points out that there's going to be layers of medicine in the future, and they aren't all going to involve the doctor. In some way they will if things get serious, but there's going to be individuals that are going to be kind of the ground one. When you walk in the door, you don't necessarily see a doctor, and you don't necessarily have to. So nurse practitioners, I think, are going to blossom. There's going to be lots of things that are changing, and as they probably should. It's certainly changing, and I think it can be for the best, and that communication is going to be a major source for keeping all things smoothly running.
Yes, I had an opportunity in my training when I was in that Department of Anthropology at the University of Oslo to be exposed to a system that's a little bit different, and the political process is handled, if you get tangled up in it at all in medicine or anywhere else. I got tangled up in it more in just reading manuscripts for the residents and this kind of stuff for English, because they wanted to write things in American English. But I was introduced to what's known as the ombudsman.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the ombudsman and their system, and their socialized system that goes back to the 19th century, you see a very interesting thing in the way they deliver health care there. And everybody has access to health care. Children are covered for both medicine and dental things until they're 18 years old. Most of this is coordinated with the family in the schools. And the other interesting thing is that when you go to see your doctor in Norway, you have to pay.
Yes. Whatever the solution is for the...
So it's interesting, I think.
It's very... people don't necessarily have to see a doctor to get medical care, and I think you're seeing that in the walk-in clinics that some of the pharmacies have, staffed by nurse practitioners, and at greatly reduced cost. I think they come out of that satisfied, for their ailments, which usually are not major and can be readily treated. I think, the neurosurgeon is not going to be one that's going to be seen very often by a patient ordinarily, but I think they'll have to go through certain avenues of access before they get to the neurosurgeon. It's always been that way to a degree.
Surely.
So.
You guys, we have a few minutes of tape left. Any comments about neurosurgery in Everett? Anything that we haven't covered you touch on?
Oh, off the record.
Yeah.
I know nothing about neurosurgery.
No, neurosurgery in Everett.
Huh?
Do anything further about neurosurgery in
Oh.
Everett that would impact Everett, that area, and anything else? We covered that pretty well.
No. Now, just in question, was Jack Johnson alive when you went to Everett?
No, he just died.
Just died. Okay. So there's the transition. Yeah. And and
Is there anything else you guys would want to say or
Huh?
put on our website about neurosurgery, the history of neurosurgery, or your practices? pursuits or careers or anything else? We covered a lot of territory.
Yeah. Well, I can make my usual rant against malpractice and so forth.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You know, I've got my views on that too.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if this would probably be the place.
I know, not really, but you know, off the record, I think they ought to make all malpractice suits go through the government, so the government is then.
That'll make you controversial, see the way
Of course it will.
Anything else?
Of course it
Anything
will.
else?
No, not really.
Well, that's why just off the record, that's why I mentioned the ombudsman, because what
Yeah.
happened to me
Yeah.
was that I did all this, I thought it was free, and the head of the department said, no, we're gonna pay you for this. And I said,
Yeah.
all right, well, fine. I said, I don't mind reading these manuscripts and suggesting to the residents how they might change their English and this kind of stuff in the papers that we're writing. And lo and behold, we didn't have much money. You know, the Guggenheim Foundation looked at how your family lived and everything else, and that's all the money they gave you. I got this big tax bill from the Norwegian government for what I had been doing, and it was just amazing. I didn't know what to tell Professor Janssen. I said, look at this, I don't understand this. He said, oh, no. He walked me across the street to the government building, went in, and in Norwegian, I could understand a little bit, told him what was going on, and then when he wanted me to understand what was going on, he'd speak in English, and that guy could speak, the ombudsman could speak in English too, and then all of a sudden, this stamp came out, boom, cancel.
Anything else you think?
That's pretty good. He was talking about the changes in the ICs unit one time, but we didn't get that all done.
The what?
Did neurosurgeons have anything to do with starting the intensive care unit at Harborview?
Well, they were recovering, it was a recovery room. The old intensive care, that's where it sort of came from. But we, as I mentioned,
No,
in my part of it,
started.
was the head injury room was really
Got
the
that.
beginning of intensive care, other than just anesthesia recovery.
Anything else you guys?
There's only one other thing about Harborview that I forgot, and that's the fact that the center floor on 4 was polio.
Mm.
And when the polio really died out, we were able to spread out, and that's when neurology was able to be put together with neurological surgery. I think it'll be obvious. I said they were together when you and I got into training.
Yeah. That polio was widespread at that time.
What time was what you were saying?
Oh, that would have been, 48 to.
Could you
50,
say,
yeah.
that back in 1948, for the polio was widespread, and get
Oh.
into that a little bit, about how it impacted Harborview?
Oh,
Well,
sure.
when the soft vaccine came along, it just wiped it out.
It did.
Yeah.
Could you start at the beginning?
Okay. Well, the polio was widespread in the late 40s and actually the early 50s, and the vaccine hadn't been developed and put out by then, so that Harborview was the center for polio patients, and we had the iron lungs, and they had lots of iron in the lungs and people in the iron lungs, and those with lesser degrees of polio. So it was a huge problem for Harborview, and it required a lot of care. And of course, once the vaccine came out, and it just kind of the incidence dropped way down. But polio, was just a scourge. You never knew how you were exposed or when you're going to be exposed, but you knew there were certain things you kind of stayed away from, like going swimming in the local pond or something like that. But it was a real scourge, and it was bad stuff. That was about it.
When we got into our residency, the polio was pretty well
Under
gone,
control,
yeah.
by then.
And that's when Fred Plum and his group moved in to
Yeah.
that whole area,
Yeah,
and urology moved out.
yeah, right. So,
But I think it's really a fascinating.
but trauma,
fascinating.
the
The one thing we haven't mentioned, Wally, was unit number 2.
Oh God.
Whenever you had a rather serious problem, particularly in infection and this kind of thing, and you really just weren't getting anywhere. You could send the patient to unit number 2, and they had excellent nursing care there. And many of them would heal right up when they got over to unit 2.
And the other side of the coin, Unit 2 was at the edge of Boeing Field, and so that airplanes coming in flew over Unit 2.
That's right.
And it was a building, kind of like a pavilion, and they had bed after bed on each side, so that, I don't know how many cots there were in that, but I would say no less than 50. And so that there was no separation of the patient. They had no privacy at all. But it was also the place where patients were sent that you knew weren't going to survive. And it got a bit of a reputation among the patients because, you know, they said, we're going to send you out to Unit 2, and they kind of give a shudder like they're going to die. That wasn't the truth of the case all the time, but
No.
it was often enough that it sent chills up a lot of patients' backs to know they're going to go to Unit 2. It was interesting. And on side glance there, Children's Orthopedic Hospital was on Queen Anne Hill, on top of Queen Anne. That was before the current spot was built, and that was interesting. And you know, the care at that time, you were sharply limited on things you could do for a lot of infections and antibiotics and so forth. But it was a haven that any child could go into the Children's Orthopedic. That was pro bono. I mean, they didn't have to pay unless they had insurance, and very few did. But the insurance field changed in the middle 60s, and it made a lot of difference because once they got Medicare and Medicaid, the patients, a lot of the trauma patients didn't want to go to Harborview, and we got a tremendous number of trauma patients at Cabrini because now they had a choice. I mean, they didn't have to go to Harborview, which was an excellent place to be treated, but not an elegant place to be staying. And they could go to the private hospital and have all the niceties that are felt to be preferable. And that was interesting. And of course, the other side of the coin about that time was that a hospital bed at Cabrini, if you were in a ward, it was $11 a day, and if you had a private room or a semi-private room, it was $12. So that it was not a whole bunch of money, but it, you know, the nurses were getting paid, I think, $220 a month. Costs were down, and the surgical prices were down too. I mean, if you did a brain tumor like an acoustic or a meningioma or something like that, and you were covered with King County Medical, you got $450, and that included 3 months of post-op care. And if you did a lumbar laminectomy or disc or something like that, you got $225, and that included 3 months of care. So the numbers were different. And when I started practicing it, I think it took me 5 years before I cleared 25,000, and I was working 16, 18-hour days most weeks. Huge change. The numbers change, and the situation has changed, and I think that we gave a great deal of pro bono treatments. I mean, of course, you never charged the doctor, you never charged the nurse, you never charged the clergy, and you know, a lot of people just couldn't pay, and it didn't make any difference. I mean, you took care of them anyway, but it isn't that way. I think it's gotten to be huge business these days, and
You know, I think in this discussion we're having, we can't forget the other hospital that was involved. Strictly from the standpoint of patient care, the medical school didn't use it, was the Marine Hospital.
right.
And of course, most of the seamen and foreign people and everybody else, foreign seamen would come in there. And I was mentioning the pain clinic that I was involved in. When we got through with the research project there, we were able to put the combined anesthesia and neurological surgery research laboratories on the top of that Marine Hospital. while it was still the U.S. Public Health Service hospital. And it was really quite an operation up there.
It really was.
An excellent lab.
I did my internship at the Marine Hospital,
Oh, I forgot that. Yeah.
USPHS,
Yeah.
and it was interesting because anybody that was floating on the water got service free. So that means if you're a waitress on a ferry boat or you're working on any kind of a boat, you got total free care. And the thing that struck me in retrospect was that of all the patients I treated, that rarely did somebody say thank you when they left. And it points up to me, and I strongly believe this, if you have something that's totally free, it's not respected. And I think you have to have some kind of a fee schedule, small or whatever, like it was in Norway and elsewhere, that there has to be something that the patient has to contribute to their care financially. And if it's totally free, that's just not going to happen. It's going to be abused. And so I think that's part of the formula that somebody's going to have to figure out in the future. It's just...
One of the things about the Marine Hospital is that we took care of the Eskimos in Alaska.
Right.
And there was a neurosurgeon in Alaska that had gotten a little bit of training under Arthur Ward. I can't remember his name now, but the story, they sent a case down to me one time at the Marine Hospital, and we were asking about kind of interesting situations, and the chief complaint of this 75-year-old Eskimo was that he couldn't ride his kayak.
But that fellow you're talking about in Alaska, he was the first chosen resident for the residency program.
That's right, he was.
And he chose not to proceed and went up to Alaska and Anchorage and became the mayor of Alaska. And he did OB-GYN or something up there. And they never got a full-time neurosurgeon until, oh golly, about the time of that big earthquake, which was about 62, 61.
Mm-hmm.
They had a fellow up there then, and but that was late.
Yeah. Well, this Eskimo was really quite interesting. One of my kind of happy remembrances of neurological surgery, because he had the biggest acoustic neuroma behind his ear that you'd ever want to see. We took that off, and he just did beautifully. And we got a note back that he could now ride his kayak.
Oh, really? Yeah.
But that was the Marine Hospital.
Right.
It was really quite interesting. Now everybody knows it at Amazon.com.
I know. Yeah.
Okay.
Rick,
Okay.
we have 4 minutes left
Yeah.
here. Anything about how important it is for hospitals to relate to one another, the one in the big city and the one in the smaller outlying areas?
Oh.
Any comments about that? We got 4 minutes.
As far as hospitals go, in the periphery, there's a difference in funding. This is at least what it was when I was practicing downtown Seattle. And they don't have access to the latest equipment and so forth. And it was kind of a given that when we developed something that was good and functional, we would give it to the hospital in the periphery when we got something more modern and could afford to get something more modern. So in that way, stuff was spread around. I think the hospital downtown, their resources for referrals differs greatly, but it's also kind of a given to me that the big centers like University of Washington and Swedish are able to attract referrals because of their ability to have the very latest in equipment and so forth that people read about, latest techniques, the cyber knife, whatever. These things get popularized and people learn about them, so that they will tend to, many times, to be referred into a center like that. It makes a difference. This is part of how big medicine has become. It's no longer mom and pop stuff. It's corporate stuff, and that makes a big difference. And I think the communication between hospitals is, a lot of it's recruitment, I think, but it's